everybody ought to get their questions out in that amount of time.
Have you heard of EVPs, and are they kind of maybe a way to add some, I guess, some proof to your theory as well? Or
Tell me what EVPs are.
that's where they get researchers and they go into different locations with like audio recorders or digital recorders, and that kind of thing.
I think it stands for electronic voice phenomenon.
Yeah, and they go into a location with these recorders. They ask questions and all that. They can't hear the responses back to them until they take the tape back and play it, and that's when sometimes the responses will be real time to their questions, and sometimes it's just seems like they're picking up stuff from like a past time and all that, right? But like you were saying that it doesn't become with your science certainty, or the probability doesn't collapse until it's measured. Could that be kind of along the same lines, that they don't hear these voices when they're there, but when they actually replay the tapes and now they're actually measuring it, that's when they're hearing these voices and whatnot?
You know, I mentioned before that there almost everything is possible, and you know, I would agree that this sort of thing does take place, and that they do get these recordings, and they do sometimes get information over them. That's basically the system is able to influence those recordings, and again, it's in the margin. There's lots of credibility issues. There's still lots of uncertainty left in it. You know, it's not a perfectly clear voice, you know, talking like I'm talking now. You know, there's enough uncertainty that it's allowable. So it falls into that margin, yes. And it's just another way of, you know, there's lots and lots of different ways of connecting with information. You know, you have the mediums, and they had tables that wobbled, and if it wobbled this way it was yes, and that way it was no. And you have people who do, they use a pendulum, and they hold a pendulum up, and the pendulum swings this way, it's yes, and that way it's no. And I guess around in a circle it's maybe. And this go on and on and on. There's lots of these devices. And if you want to set such a device up, you can make one up, you know, and that's just another device. Take a recording thing out and, you know, see if you can't capture something on it. You can make up your own devices if you wish, set them up, and if your intent is for it to work in a certain way, like your pendulum, you know, this is yes and this is no, basically what's going on is your consciousness has an intent that this is a communications medium. The way your pendulum swings or what your recorder picks up is the output format that you want. And as long as there's enough uncertainty in it that it doesn't violate any of the rules and your intent is clear, then it'll work. Okay. So that's the thing. So it's not that there's anything magic about the pendulum, you know, or any of the other devices, or a Ouija board. You know, it's the same thing. You get a Ouija board and you put your hands there and it moves. Well, the way these things work is that there is a lot of uncertainty in the motion. Like with the Ouija board, moving your hands in this kind of way with your arms up, just tiny little motions are hardly controllable. And if you just try to hold your hands still, they're generally not all that still. They just move around a little bit. You're kind of at that point where little motions are easy to do. So within that uncertainty, it's easy to, you know, for something to guide it. Same with a pendulum. When you're holding a pendulum, just any tiny little motion will make that thing move. So again, it's in the uncertainty. So if you design most any sort of experiment, there are those people that do, what is it called? Not kinesthetics, but something or other. Yeah, maybe. And they will hold your arm up here and they'll say, you know, whatever. You know, they'll call out a name of a poison or something, and then if that's something that affects you, you know, you're weak and otherwise you're strong. It's the same thing. They set up a thing where most of us don't have a lot of strength that way because we don't stick our arms out and lift a lot of things. You know, those muscles tend to be very weak. So it's one of those things that just a little bit this way or that, you know, in the noise again, that can be weaker or stronger. They set up the intent. They use this as the output format of the device, and it's because of the intent of the instructor, the intent of the person doing this that sets that up, that then makes that work. You know, so that's the point. There's nothing really, magic about any of that. And that's why you can get one person can do this with the pendulum or the kinesiology. Did I say that right?
Kinesiology.
Kinesiology. Okay, kinesiology. That one person can do it and do it very well and be effective with it, and somebody else can come in and say, well, I don't believe that doesn't work. Here, let me try it. And of course it doesn't work. Well, that's because they don't have the, they don't have the intent. They haven't set this up. It's just something they're doing, and then it's just a pendulum. It doesn't say anything. The only reason it talks to the person that uses it is because that's the way they've set up their intent for their output. It's just like us setting up an intent that we're going to see illness as black spots in a white gingerbread cookie. It's just a different process of the same thing. And the people who do are doing the Ouija board, they set up in their mind a thought process that says, I'm just going to hold my hands out here and, spirit, ask a question, give me an answer. And then things start going around. And of course, it's the same thing. They say, well, I don't know if I was just doing that or if it did it on its own, It's that sort of thing. So it's yes, all those things do have some veracity to them in the hands of somebody who has a focused intent and is using that as their output format of the data. And you can come up with other things. You can make up other sorts of things. They're just focusing tools, focusing intent tools. And if that's a tool that helps you focus your intent, then that'll work for you. You got a question there in the back.
You say that intent is what causes the uncertainty to collapse, whether one way or the other, right? Or when there's enough uncertainty?
The measurement causes the uncertainty to collapse. The intent is what modifies the probability, so you can make that happen the way you want it.
Is that what explains quantum tunneling for small particles?
No, quantum tunneling for small particles is just explained with statistics. It's explained in a similar way, but there's a probability because they are not physical particles. They're just probability particles until you measure them. So they're kind of in there somewhere, but you don't know where, right? Well, that probability distribution that you saw in that picture kind of goes from minus infinity, it peaks, goes all the way out to infinity. Okay, that's a pretty big space that they can be in. It's most likely they're right here, but then they could be here, they could be there. Well, with statistics, when you say it could be here, it could be there, it may be only 1 in 100,000 that it's way out here, but that's not zero. And if you have 100,000 particles, then there's a good chance you're going to find one of them out here someplace. And the fact that that happens to be a barrier between them that they shouldn't be able to get through as particles, they can still be found. And it's said that they tunnel through, but again, that's just a metaphor. They're not tunneling. They're just existing outside of the hole that they're in. Basically, they get through it. So it's just a matter of, yes, the measurement hasn't been done. They have a probability to be over a wide area. Sometimes they are.
Does the intent influence the result at all?
You can influence that result. You can influence any result that is uncertain, and there's probability there. You can influence that result because you can probably raise the number of these particles that happen to fall outside of the potential well that they're in. Now, you're not going to suddenly cause a cascade or other things, but you can bias that so that you get more of them than you expect. Okay, that sort of thing, or less of them than you expect. So you'll bias it a little this way and that, and then what becomes improbable is the fact that you can bias it in the same way, positive or negative, with your will. That's what's remarkable, not the fact that it's a few percent more or a few percent less. So yes, you can affect things like that. Okay, another question? April?
I'm still confused about how to be in the present moment yet still parallel process. Because if you're trying to be in the moment and not necessarily looking into the past or the future, but yet you're parallel processing, then are you taking away from being in the very present moment? So I don't really know how to ask the question, but I'm just still confused about that.
Okay, your confusion, comes from the words, actually. It's an English language problem where our words are not very specific. Being in the moment basically means that your awareness is here and your decisions are here. You're deciding, you're taking, you have choices, right? You make choices all the time. Those choices are being made in the present moment. You're not thinking ahead of what you're going to do. That would be thinking of a choice in the future. You don't spend time thinking about the choices you've made. That's in the past, but you're just making choices now. So something, your life is ongoing. This is the present moment. You interact with it, you focus on it, and you make your choices consciously in the present. We make a lot of choices in the present moment that are not conscious. We move through our lives often like machines, like robots. We're just going through the motions. Everything from, driving our cars and we get home, we don't know how we got there, things like that. We're not really in the moment. We're just, habitual. Just doing things we do because that's what we always do without really being aware. So being aware in the moment means that you're present with what you're doing. You're not off thinking something else. You're not, your mind is here. And when your mind is here, interacting here, you're making your decisions here and you're making them intentionally. You're not just making them because that's the way you always make them. So it's a matter of focus, really. And you can have your focus here and be interacting here and still be aware that you have an appointment tomorrow. It's not like when you're in the moment, everything, that's going to happen and all of your responsibilities disappear everywhere except in here. It kind of sounds that way with the language, but it's not that way. So you can be in the moment and you interact just as it happens and still be aware of what's coming, still be aware of what's been. It's not that you shut those out of your awareness entirely, but you, the actor, the choice maker, the person that is executing reality, are aware of what you're doing now, and you're doing it for intentioned purpose. You're not just kind of wandering through absent-mindedly. So that's really what it means. But the words are confusing. Does that help? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hopefully life is a system of evolution. So if before I die, or just prior to dying, I've lowered my entropy, now I die, do I carry that evolution forward to the next lifetime, or am I bound to be born with a higher entropy?
No, you carry that forward. Yeah,
We do evolve.
Yeah, I would call that like the conservation of quality. As you grow up, you lower your entropy, then you start wherever you left off. Okay, and the same is in reverse. If instead of growing up, you're messing up and you're increasing your entropy, you don't get to go back to where you entered last time. You have to start wherever you leave off. It's a continuous process, and you pick up where you left off. Yes, so you do make progress. Otherwise, progress would be impossible. You'd always be starting over, and there'd be no end to it. That's not the way it is. Andrea?
I've got a few questions. Is your big toe complete? And if it is that sort of the goal, so we can have like a certain level of entropy and then not worry about, that kind of picture? And if not, will there be amendments to your books? Further books?
Well, first of all, nothing is ever complete. When you come to the point that you think you know it all, it's probably the point where you know very little. You never get to that point. There's always new data. You have to always be open to new data. Let's put it that way. If you're open-minded, then there's always the possibility of new data. There's always the possibility that something will come up, some fact, some experiment will be done that contradicts, what you're saying. And in which case, then you have to modify your theory to broad enough to accept the new data, or you have to abandon that part of your theory and look for another way to explain it. Or you say, I can't explain it. That falls outside of my theory. I don't know how to explain that. So yes, you have to always be open. I mean, it's like when I was writing these books, you write them and you get to a point, and Pamela will probably laugh when she hears that, and I'll say, I'm done. I'm finished, I got it the way I want it, you know, and then of course, a month later, she'll hear, I'm done, I've got it the way I want it, you know, and it goes on and on. I've been done writing those books probably, you know, a dozen times. I was done. And then there's, oh, yeah, I didn't say that very well, or a question would come up. So you're never done. You know, you have to publish the book sooner or later, you know, that's just the way it is. Any engineer will tell you there's a time, you know, that you have to quit with the theory and actually make a product. Us physicists, we don't tend to worry about products too much. We just, you know, keep going. So I have Pamela who can tell me when to quit sometimes. But yes, the books are never done. Things will come up. There were some things on the forum that came up. A person wrote in and said, you know, when I'm in an old forest and such, you know, I get these feelings and I connect to the land and to the environment there, and I communicate with it, you know. And what's that all about? Because in my books, I don't talk about anything except sentient consciousness, right, and up. And I thought about that a while, and it's like, well, gee, that's something that I really didn't write about. So we wrote back and forth and kind of answered that question, you know, what's going on there and how does that work and what are you communicating with? So yes, there's always new things. I do not know everything. I did not put everything in my books, and that's just a place to start.
So the toe and the consciousness are the same. It's
Well, the toe is a model.
right.
The toe is a model of consciousness. It's a model of reality. Remember, we started off and said that, you know, you actually don't get to experience the territory. You really only get to experience the map. And that's because you have to get out of consciousness to look at consciousness from the outside. And because we are consciousness, getting out of consciousness is a problem. It's hard enough for most of us just to get out of the physical reality, you know, and there's all this other consciousness out there, but actually to get out of consciousness, we don't know yet what we would be getting into. So that's not an objective thing. It's just out there. And does it affect us? Yes, just like the slide that shows the bacterium in the small intestine. Does the sun and rain affect it? Yes, very much, because that determines what kind of food comes to it. But it's outside of its reality frame. It just can't get out there. It wouldn't survive out there. It probably only survives in a nice acid environment or whatever. You know, it's kind of stuck with its limited knowledge, and we are too. So no, my toe is not the last word on, you know, on all existence and all reality. It's just as far as I've gotten to the present time. It's been developing for 35 years or so, and it got to a point where it was ready to write it down. And partly I was writing it down because somebody asked me, came up and said, well, Tom, how does all this work? You know, I thought, good question. So I tried to explain it, and 7 or 8 hours later, I was still trying to explain it, and I thought, I need to write this down so that it gets more coherent. When you write things down, they get more coherent for you. It forces clarity. It's easy to walk around with fuzzy ideas. It's really hard to write fuzzy writing, because when you write something, it says something very particular. And often it's not exactly what you mean. So then you fiddle with it until it is closer to what you mean. And in that process, you understand more of what you're really thinking. It forces you to become clear. So, yes.
But isn't what you're writing about what Einstein and Bohr could experience? Is that in fact like the theory of everything?
Isn't that the thing that unifies it?
Yes, that's true. So what I have done with this theory is, you can see right where Einstein got stuck, and this just goes right on by it. It says, okay, they knew consciousness was at the heart of reality. That was clear to them. They knew this reality somehow was a function of consciousness. That was clear to them. But then they didn't know what to do next. And now this says what to do next. And it's not take somebody down and cut their brains out and study that. That's physical. And it's not put them in a lab and give them psychological tests. That's psychological. It's not in that realm. It's consciousness. So yes, consciousness is at the root, and they got that right, but they didn't know how to go beyond. What this says is how to go beyond. That it's personal. That the reality's in here. That it's a virtual reality. That it's an information system, and it explains that in a model such that you can see the next step. And then, gee, guess what? the reason for particles being probability distributions pops right out. So it starts answering science questions. And the reason why a speed of light is constant, even though the source of it is moving, pops right out as a logical consequence. So it starts answering physics problems that can't be answered, which then kind of gives you some sense of credibility that you've got a theory that's making sense. And then it starts explaining things like precognitive dreams and psychic healing and all these other kind of paranormal things. They come out of that as a logical explanation too. So the way that what makes a theory valuable is that it explains the data. And as far as I know, this explains all the data. I don't have any data that this doesn't explain. So if I do get data this doesn't explain, then I'll start thinking about expanding it so that it will explain it. Or I'll admit that I don't know how to expand it. So it just grows. Everything grows. Knowledge is never done. You just keep understanding more. Just keep peeling that onion back till you get a bigger and bigger view. Now, whether we can actually get a bigger view than this, whether this big toe is kind of the biggest view we can get because the next view is outside of consciousness, that might be so. Like I say, it's not an infinite series. There's no reason to think that, that the onion has infinite numbers of layers. You'll someday get to the point where that's as much as you can know, and maybe this is it. But we'll see. 100 years from now, people will have a whole different idea about the nature of reality than they do now. So it's just a growing thing. That's the way science and technology and everything works. You do what you can now, and others will pick that up and do more with it later if they can. So I don't know whether we've hit the end stop or not. As far as I know, we've hit the end stop. The next stop is outside of consciousness, and I think that's probably beyond our, outside of our knowing. But this unifies everything that we know here, all the data. So you use it, you look at the data in Taoism, look at the data in Lao Tzu, and see what he's saying and the kind of thing, and it just makes sense. It fits right in here. What Buddha said, it makes right sense. It fits right in here. You have to interpret it. They speak in description and in poetry, and they don't speak in science. Not talking about entropy and things, but you see it all fits. It goes together. All the data points get connected under one thing. So, yes, I believe it's as complete as I can get it now. But it would be foolish of me to say it is totally complete. This is it. I don't know anybody can say that. Even if it was totally complete and this is it, it would be foolish to believe that and stop looking. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Yeah, let's say somebody asks you, so when you hear 5, 6, 10 voices, do you think that's like 5 different consciousness, or do you think that the person's creating those voices, or?
Person who hears voices?
Yeah, sometimes you have somebody that hears, they hear 5, 6, 7 different voices. Yeah.
Yeah, there can be various reasons for almost everything. Reality is not simple, that there's just one explanation for almost anything. There's always lots of possibilities. It could be that they just happen to be tied in to other reality systems, and they're hearing these voices. It could be that this larger system has connected to them in ways that they have personalized and then categorized into various voices. It could be that they're just having spurious firings inside their brain, so they're getting impulses and neurons flying around just because of what do we say, damaged or non-standard, brain chemistry. That can go on too. Remember I said that the consciousness leads and the body follows. Okay, as you change consciousness, as you grow, your brain structure actually changes that way to support that. So your brain structure changes to give you the basis in this reality. It's a analog of your consciousness. Your brain and your body represent your consciousness. So as it changes, that gives you more facility to do things, to understand things, to see things. So the brain actually does that. Now sometimes the brain will change that way, not because you learn something, because it's just got some errant biochemistry going, and then you may get some connections. So some people just, fall off a ladder and bang their head, and after that, things change for them. They start seeing things, start having precognitive dreams, or they start seeing auras or other kinds of things. They've just done a little alteration of their, electrochemical processes and duplicated something that they haven't earned, but they get it anyway. It's just an accident. So there's all kinds of spurious things that kind of happen by accident. In the large population, that's just a weird happening, right? So we look at people like that and we say, something wrong with them. Well, there may not be anything wrong with them other than that they have a connection that they can't understand and can't deal with. And they're just talking to other entities. Or there are entities out there who will pester some people for one reason or another. Some kind of past life connection. And that energy will you can use the word attack, that may be a little strong, but it'll pester, it will annoy, it'll stick with somebody. And they just carry that around with them. There are lots of things out there that all have free will. So you can say, well, that wouldn't be nice, but they have free will, they don't have to be nice. So you do have this, but it's out in the margins. It's one in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, that happens to, but there's all sorts of strange things. Almost anything that can happen does happen occasionally. So there's not a standard reason for that, but there's lots of ways that it could happen. They could have done something very unpleasant to 4 or 5 people, and those 4 or 5 people are just trying to antagonize them now.
The story of John Nash, Dr. Nash?
Yes.
Where those 2 characters never changed?
Yeah, 2 characters never changed. Now again, you don't know whether that was his brain chemistry by accident. When people have these kind of accidental brain chemistry things that open up them to larger reality systems, how do we look at that? Well, we just say they're crazy, there's something wrong with them. That doesn't mean that, we label people insane who are different. If they sense differently than we do, if they see different things than we do and hear different things than we do, then obviously we're not insane, so they must be. It's that sort of thing. And we need a little more humility there and basically label these people as different and understand that they are sensing and communicating and doing in a different way than us. And sometimes it's not, it's not profitable for them. Take people with autism, where are they? What are they connected to? They're obviously not in this reality either. Well, if they have it severely. Autism can be from very, very mild, which is what Asperger's or something like that, to very severe to where they're just totally dysfunctional. They can't speak, they can't dress themselves, they can't do anything. Well, where are they? What are they experiencing? They live in a reality that's entirely different than our reality. They have mental function going on, they are doing things, going places, they have a life there. It just doesn't translate well here. It makes them non-productive here.
What about Alzheimer's people that have been here, have a full life now, or?
Yeah, Alzheimer people, they're a case of people where the supporting infrastructure that's required in this physical reality degenerates and will no longer support the function. Now that doesn't mean that their consciousness degenerates, it just means their ability to express that consciousness here degenerates. They still have the same consciousness, that they had before they got Alzheimer's, but they can't express it physically. They can't express it in this reality frame.
But is that consciousness going out in other reality frames? Or not?
That consciousness may be doing almost anything. What you're actually getting here is that you lose control of your expression of it here. Your memory goes, your cognitive ability, your analytical ability, all that kind of disappears. You still have a little bit of it here, but that consciousness is still alive and well and healthy, in non-physical space. It's not like that means that they've just degenerated and de-evolved. The body doesn't lead. See, the body follows. In this case, the body's damaged, whether it's through degenerative, illness like Alzheimer's, or whether it's because there was an accident happened and somebody lost, half their brain because of an explosion or a car accident or that kind of thing. If you damage, your brain, you damage the ability to express yourself here. It changes you because now you don't have all the parts and pieces you need to do the interpretation correctly to interact here. So you don't do the interpretation. Again, it's like taking your computer and ripping out half the RAM. Well, suddenly it doesn't work so well anymore. Or take your hard drive and pull out half the sectors. Well, now your document only has every other page or something. You don't function well that way. But
so what is the consciousness doing of an Alzheimer's person? It could be still exploring and learning.
Yes, the consciousness of an Alzheimer's patient is probably turned off the game and gone someplace else. It's like if you're playing your video game and your character, gets stuck in a pit someplace and you can't get it out and you can't get it loose and whatever else. Well, what do? You just don't sit there and stare at the screen. You punch the reset button, or you just go away and say, I'll come back later. The consciousness of an Alzheimer's patient is just waiting to collect the rest of its consciousness when that body finally dies. It's probably left the scene and is no longer interested in what's going on in this physical reality because there's no learning going on here anymore. The learning shifted someplace else. So there's no, because there's no longer decisions and feedback and all that. The person doesn't even know they're here or anybody here. So that capacity to learn here is gone. So their point for being here is gone. My guess is that the larger consciousness, turns off the screen and pays attention to something else. Starts looking on what it's going to do next time. And it just has to wait for the physical condition to deteriorate until it, recollects the rest of its bits. So it's that kind of a thing.
How much bits is left? How much is gone?
We're a fragment of our whole conscious self. The part that's here is just part. It's not like 100% of our consciousness is engaged in this game. There's another part that is not, and that's what we often call our higher self. Well, it's just our self that doesn't happen to be focused here. It doesn't have to abide by this rule set, but it's still just us. We're a reflection of it. It's not terribly smarter than we are. I mean, it projected us, which was a expression of itself to learn. So it's not like that higher self is a brilliant avatar that knows everything. It's basically struggling at about the same level that we are, but it's not encumbered with this rule set. Okay, somebody that hasn't asked a question before?
In this line of thought, what are your thoughts on euthanasia? When, let's say, the body is no longer able to express consciousness really to be
Yes, my ideas on that? Okay. If you have a body that's dysfunctional here, and a body that's dysfunctional to the point that there's no hope that it's going to be functional, then that body's just not doing any good here. You might as well let that go. There's no point in continuing that just to continue it. The body is not that important. The body is a tool for evolution. And when that body no longer can serve that purpose, then let the body go. There's no point in just keeping it alive for no other reason. Now, you have to be careful about when you say that body no longer has an opportunity to evolve. Just because you've had an accident and you're a paraplegic and you can't move any part of your body, maybe except your eyes, that doesn't mean you have no ability to evolve. There's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of giving things up and accepting and of being graceful in your existence for what you do have and communicating as you head. There's a lot of learning for the people around you. So you don't say that, well, this person's not up at their peak, let's get rid of them, That's not it. There's a lot of learning in a lot of situations. But where there is none, let the body go. There is no point in it. Stan?
A real strength of autistic people, particularly autistic children, seems to be they have a strong ability to hold intent. And that would seem to be a strength if one put it to learning healing. What are your thoughts on kind of connecting these two areas?
Yes, I think that's an interesting idea. A lot of autistic people can put that intent, that focus, to all sorts of things. You'll have autistic people who get into numbers, get into arithmetic, and you can say to one of them, what's the square root of 6,384, which none of us are going to come up with without a calculator, and they'll tell you right off the top of their head what that answer is, and when you punch it up on your calculator, it'll be right. They can do some amazing things. Some of them get into history, and they can tell you all the details of almost everything that's been written in a history book because they're so focused on it. Their intent is so focused in that area. I agree, that's a talent they have, and partly they have that talent because they're disconnected from the physical reality. We're all so absorbed with all the physical stuff going on, we have a hard time focusing on anything. That's why it's so hard to meditate. That's why it's so hard to find that point consciousness. When you're not absorbed in this physical reality because of a brain chemistry issue, that leaves you kind of free to do other things. And some of them do get into those other things. Some of them don't. Now, how would you reach them to a point that you could get them interested in healing and doing things like that? I don't know, but I suspect they could be just as good at that as they are sometimes at arithmetic and do some amazing things because they have some amazing opportunities not being drugged down like we are with this physical reality, and they have some amazing disadvantages too in this physical reality. They can't function very well here. They're just different. It's often mental illness is just a factor of people who sense and see and operate differently. And if we can find their strengths and then play to those strengths, yes, what an advantage, rather than wasting those strengths, putting them on drugs and warehousing them because they don't function well in the physical. What a sad waste of potential. Yeah. Yes.
I wonder if you can speak about animals and their consciousness. And maybe another question, how did you find out about intent being the tool to actually alter our experience?
Okay, first animals. Animals are conscious just like we are. Well, not just like we are in the sense that they don't have a human consciousness, but they're conscious critters. So are bumblebees, so are all sorts of critters. If a critter has sentience, which means you can interact with it, then basically it's making choices. The choices may be very dim, and I discussed that in the books in terms of decision space. A human has a lot of decision space. There's a lot of decisions and choices that you'll get to make. Okay, a dog has fewer decision space, a smaller decision space. There's not as many decisions that it gets to make. More of what it does is just hardwired in. It's just, they do it because they do it. It's not really a decision. Decision spaces get smaller. Okay, now you get down to a bumblebee and it's, even smaller decision space, but it still has some decisions that it can make, that are its own free will decisions. And you get down to something as dim as a clam, and there's very, very few decisions that it can make. Basically, pull in the foot or not, open the shell or not, and some of that is even just kind of hardwired. But there are some decisions that have to do with food gathering and mating and so on that it can do or not do, and it has to know when to do it and not to do it. So there's a few little decisions that it can make. So consciousness varies by decision space. Animals communicate telepathically with each other and with us. You can communicate with an animal, but you're not going to communicate in English. They're not going to speak in English to you. Hello, how are you doing? I'm your dog. It's not going to be like that. You're going to get feeling. You're going to get it. You're going to get attitude. You're going to get need. You're going to get those kinds of things, and it'll just come to you in a feeling sense. So you can communicate with animals, and you can heal animals just like you can heal other people. There's nothing really that special about the human animal. It's just a critter with a large decision space, very dangerous critter with a large decision space. That's mainly the difference. So it's just different grades, kind of different levels of all the same thing. And our dogs evolving, yes, their consciousness, they're evolving just the same. Inside that decision space, they can make decisions that help them evolve and decisions that can help them de-evolve. They're just in a smaller space with it. But some of them, some critters, if they can evolve to a point where they need to express themselves, express their consciousness with a different body, can then evolve, let's say, as a human, even though they've never been human before, because they've gotten to the point where they can express their consciousness in human form. They're probably starting at the bottom in the human line, but maybe not all the way to the bottom. So yes, consciousness evolves, and you can, it's not like dogs always stuck in dogs. It's just a continuum of awareness and growth, and you hop in at the level at which you are competent. You hop in at the level that you're ready for. You work in that level until you've outgrown it, and then you start over at the next one. There's always another challenge. Okay, anybody else here?
Can you go backwards like human to dog?
Yes, you can, but again, now you're out in the 10 sigma margin. Again, almost everything is possible. You wouldn't do that because you expected to evolve yourself, because your decisions are now so restricted, but you might do that just for a special reason, just for some connection you wanted to make somehow. So sometimes you do that. Most of your incarnations are focused on your growth. Sometimes, if you're attached to something special, you can make an incarnation for another reason. Again, we have the general rule, and then we have the exceptions. There are exceptions in almost anything. The general rule, you will incarnate back here because this is what you know. This is what you're good at. This is the game you know how to play. If you incarnate in one of these other divisions outside of N divisions, you don't know how to play that game. You're like a fish out of water there. You don't know what to do, how to act, whatever. It's harder. So we tend to do what's familiar, but then that doesn't mean that nobody has ever incarnated across these division lines. So yeah, it happens sometimes. Some of them come here, some of us go there, but it's all in the margins.
I sometimes wonder where a Saddam Hussein or Adolf Hitler went. Did they go into like nothingness, or into maybe an animal form, or would they stay human?
No, they would stay human. They just got into a downward spiral of egotism, control, power, force. You don't have to be Hitler to be affected by control, power, force. Control, power, force probably describes about 80% of how we deal with each other, in this reality frame. Some people just have the good luck or the misfortune, depending on how you're looking at it, of getting really good at control, power, and force, and happening to be in a situation where they can express that. For every Hitler that was able to do the damage and kill the millions and do the things that he did, there's probably 100,000 more that would have done the same if they'd had the opportunity. You see, it's not that he's such an exceptional being. He just happened to have an exceptional opportunity to express the level of being that he was. And that's, what happens to him when he dies. He does the same as the rest of us. He gets to a point where he gets to evaluate what he's done and where he's gone and the things he needs to learn and what he did badly. And he gets a little re-education, a little, pep talk, and he gets sent back in a position where he can learn some of those things. Probably not in a position where he can de-evolve quite so much, quite so quickly. The system will pick a better spot for him, and it's probably one that doesn't have a lot of power attached to it. And he may need to work himself back up out of that hole. That's a pretty deep hole to put yourself in. It may take a while to dig yourself, to climb out of that hole. But it's not like you're done and that's the end of you, and you become an oyster on the bottom of the bay or something as punishment. It's not like that. That was a bad time for his growth, right? But on the other hand, he did create a whole lot of growth and opportunities for a lot of other people. He created a lot of stir. He stirred the pot. And when you stir the pot, you create opportunities, you create connections and things and challenges and opportunities to grow. Who was that guy that wrote the book? He was a Jewish man and his wife. He was captured. They were both, Viktor Frankl. If you've ever read his book, basically here he was being experimented on, operations done on him, of course, with no anesthesia or anything else, just people cutting on his body to see how he would react and things like that. And what did he do? He rose above it. He didn't, he basically took the attitude, they know not what they do. He rose above it and developed a whole new area of psychology based on it. He had no bitterness. His wife was killed. Her experiments didn't allow her to live, and it was a horrible thing he went through, but when he came out of it, he was a better, lower entropy, more evolved person than when he went into it. There are opportunities for us to grow in almost anything. What was the name of that book? Do you remember?
Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, Man's Search for Meaning. Yeah. So there are opportunities. Sometimes it's harsh. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we fail. But again, maintaining your life here, living long is not the point. The point is learning. I guess if you were in a native culture, you'd say living with honor. That's the same thing. That's living rightly, right action. And if that right action leads you to a place where the body is killed, then that's a success. It's not a failure because you're killed. It's a success because you led with right action, and next time you incarnate, you'll be a little further ahead for it. So the drama that goes on here is not as significant as we make it. It's just drama. Somebody stirs the pot, and that gives us a lot of drama, and gives us opportunities to interact. And we die or survive or whatever it is we do, but it's the method in which we do it. It's how we do that. How do we carry ourselves to whatever it is that we have to face? That's what's important. Okay.
You say that when we are likely to come back here because we're familiar with this PMR. How much of this physical matter reality do we bring back or comes back with us to our native consciousness? How much of it do we actually remember as a consciousness entity once we're out of here?
Very little. Okay, the point is to come back with a fresh start, not to come back with the burdens that you're left with. What you want to do is get rid of all the beliefs and things that were hampering you, that trapped you, in your growth. You want all that gone. All your relationship stuff is gone. You got to start over basically with a clean slate so that you don't continually get hampered by past mistakes.
Is that something that's done automatically when we
when you come in, you just start. You have to start with your physical experience. You start gaining physical experience fresh. Now, you still have consciousness. Okay, you still kept all of what you've grown. So there's certain things that'll come to you much quicker. There's certain attitudes and aspects and the way you relate to people and all of that. That's a part of you that you have earned through whatever incarnations you've had. So it's not like you always start at a beginning level evolution. No, you start at where you left off. So as you mature, as you grow, the way you integrate your experience is different for everybody because we all come in starting differently. So we come in with a blank set of facts. Okay, we don't have any facts. We don't have any relationship to stuff, so we have to start over. We have to learn who we are. We have to learn how to move our hands. We have to relearn language. We have to, learn all sorts of things like that. But if we were well evolved before, we will get back to that state fairly quickly. We will mature to it quickly. We all know people that are, 10 years old or 15 years old or something like that, and they seem so grown up. They have bigger pictures. They relate to things in a different way. And we also know people who are 45 or 50 years old, and they seem so childish. And they, can't relate to bigger pictures, and they can't deal with relationship. So it's not just, you come here as a blank slate. You come here with a lot, but it's not facts. You come here with substance. So the substance comes with you, but none of that's physical. That's all non-physical. That's all the quality of your consciousness.
Are fears part of that too?
Sometimes. Mostly they are not. Mostly the fears get erased along with other facts. But sometimes those fears are so, we're so focused on them. Okay, they become such a big part of our consciousness that we don't let them go. So sometimes people do come back with fears already built in. That's unfortunate, but it's either that or not come back at all because they're not ready to let those go. So that's what I would call an obsession. Consciousness can get obsessed. That's the same reason that you have, what they call discarnate spirits, inhabiting a house, your ghost and your other sorts of things. Somebody that is obsessed with a particular thing, position, structure, people. That's why you have sometimes, 4 or 5 people that are annoying, an individual, and they hear the voices because there's an obsession going on there. And that consciousness gets obsessed, and in the transition period, the entities there trying to help it, they try to get it out of the obsession, but there's free will. You can be obsessed if you want to. And they make an effort to get you out of that obsession, but sometimes the best thing to do is, just go on back and try to deal with it through another lifetime, rather than sit out until you can somehow get over it, because sometimes new experience is the only way you're going to get over it. So yes, they do come back like that, but that's in the margin. That's more the exception than the rule. For most of your ordinary fears, of the boogeyman under the bed and the rest of the things, that just disappears, and you don't bring that back.
Is there a process, like when you go out of body, I use that term, but when you get to as Robert Monroe would say, to different levels out of body, you encounter your fears, or you at least you face your fears. When you die, do you go through that same process of facing those fears to try to disperse them?
No, it's not the same. It's not the same process. You go through a process of reevaluating what you've done and where you are and what you need to go next. But many of the fears melt away. Okay, you don't deal with them. Those are fears that you got here. They kind of belong here. They're the fears that generated here, because while you were here and you were 3 years old and a big dog, bit you on the hand or something, and now you're terrified of big dogs. Well, that's a fear that belongs here. That disappears. Okay, those kinds of things are gone. But now while you're here and you go out of body and you're frightened, your fear may manifest into a big dog, because that's something you're afraid of. So those kinds of things don't go, and you don't have to work through those. They just disappear. That was just garbage you picked up here, and you let that go when you die. But now if that experience with that big dog caused you to have some kind of fear, that it wasn't just maybe a phobia of dogs, but let's say it did something to you that caused you to actually de-evolve. You became hateful to animals, and you'd sneak around and poison them, and you do other kinds of things because of it. All right, now that is going to lower, or is going to raise your entropy. It's going to lower your level of evolution. So now you're going to go backwards, and yes, you will bring that back, the lower level, not necessarily the thing with the dog, but just the lower level. Okay. Ron, you haven't asked a question yet. Yeah, your turn.
The vibrations that Robert was talking about before he went out of body, is that something that's common, or is that just his own experience?
That's something that's very common. The vibration state is a perception that we have. It is there is a thing in the body as your awareness leaves it that seems to experience that. It is about a 4 hertz thing, and as you give it your attention, it gets stronger. If you let your attention go from it, it'll get less. But it's a good marker for when your EEG, if you had an EEG on at the time that was measuring your brainwave activity, you'd find that when you get in that pulsation state, almost all of your EEG energy is in the theta region. So what it is, it's kind of a biofeedback sign of you being in an altered state that's very focused in theta. That's a very productive state when you get that. If you just let that body go ahead and vibrate, Forget about it. Let it vibrate. Say, that's fine. That's that's a good sign. Let it vibrate. And go off and do things. That's a good place. While you're in that vibration state, you can do better. You'll be more effective at healing. You'll be more effective at remote viewing. That's a real effective state because that's the theta state.
Prerequisite to going out of body then?
Well, when you're in that vibration state, if you think about it, you feel that your body is vibrating, don't you? You feel like your body's elastic and it's just got these waves, like you're made out of your rubber sheet, right? And somebody's shaking it. You have that kind of sense. If you put your attention on it, it'll get stronger. And it can get so strong that it's almost like you can't stand it and you have to get away from it. But if you don't feed it with your attention, and if it feeds your fear, then of course it'll get really strong. But if you just let it be, and you think about when you've been in those states, you'll realize that while you were vibrating, you really weren't attached to the physical at all. While you're in that vibration state, you weren't aware that you were lying in a bed. You didn't feel the sheets. You didn't feel the pillow. You didn't hear the dog 3 doors down, howling. None of that, all that stuff was gone. When you're in that vibration state, you're already out of your body, in a sense. You've already left the physical behind. Now it's a matter, it's like that point consciousness state in a way. It's not quite, it's different, but it's a similar kind of thing. You already are detached from the physical. All you have to do now is use an intent to decide, what do you want to do? Okay, here I am, now what do I want to do? Okay, and now if you're lying there and say, well, what I want to do is have a out of body like Bob Monroe. I want to get out of my body and look back at it sleeping and then go around through my house and then up through the roof. Well, now you're trying to have Bob Monroe's experience. You're saying, okay, what I want to do is duplicate Bob Monroe's experience. Stop trying to duplicate somebody else's experience. You don't need to do Bob's out of body. Just decide what you want to do with your intent. What's going to happen here is that what is good for you to help you learn isn't necessarily Bob's experience. That was Bob's experience. That helped him learn, and that was something he could share with everybody else. Got a lot of people excited about metaphysics and so on, that got them working and exploring and investigating. So that was a good thing. And that was Bob's mission, and that's what he did, and he did it well. That may not be your mission. So you're in that state, say, good, now what do I want to do with it? Have an intent. Go do something. Get some evidence. Go do some remote viewing and get some evidence. Find out. If you remote view some friend's house, call them up, see if you were there. Heal somebody, see if they get better. Then heal somebody and see if they get better. Keep doing that kind of stuff, but just lay in that pulsation state without trying to duplicate the out-of-body experience. If that's what you need, if that's an experience that's important to your growth, will to do that and you'll do it. If that really is irrelevant to your growth, you can will that and probably won't happen because it's really not important to your growth. So that's the best way to answer that.
He asked if it was a prerequisite. I think the other part of the question is it required to go through the pulsation state to get to the out-of-body state?
No, the other part of the question is no, it's not required. It's just something that is very, very common. A lot of people feel that and they get in that vibration state. That was one of the things that Bob reported because he got into it all the time before he went out of body. It's not required. You can bypass it if you like. So no, it's not a requirement. It's just common, and so many people get it that they need to know that they're lying there and they're expecting to do. They want to redo Bob's experience, so they basically waste a state trying to do somebody else's experience. They should make use of that state. It happens to a lot of people. It's just a sense of being elastic and pulsing.
Let me give an example and then ask a question. The example would be a very large scale event of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi group, hundreds of thousands or whatever the number was, of having the intent that crime in Washington should decrease in a particular time window. With that example in mind, what is the effect of that aggregation, bulk aggregation of huge multi-person, 10 to the 5 people having the intent of that? What does that do to violate skirt or not violate anti-uncertainty principle in your model, considering that the observation is being taken in Washington all day long of what the crime rate is, and you just watch in real time reading.
Right.
So with that human measurement or human observation of it, what are your...
Well, what you do there is that it's the same sort of thing that we've been talking about. If you have an intent and that there's some uncertainty as to what the crime's going to be tomorrow in Washington, and if you apply that intent to that future probability, and in doing so, you can modify the outcome. Okay, you can lower the probability peak of the crime in Washington by having that intent. Now, if you have 1,000 people or 100,000 people that have that same intent at that same time, they are a lot more effective. It tends to be additive. It tends to almost be like vector addition. You have a lot more effect. So one person may move it a little bit, a lot of people will move it a lot more. But there is a limit. You still have to, you can only move it within the range that's inside of what's credible for the system. In other words, you may get a 20% fluctuation. Well, that's unusual, but it's not impossible. Okay, you may get a 2 or 3, so you're not going to get suddenly, there is no crime in Washington, D.C. Nobody commits a crime, and nobody's committed a crime now for 6 months. That's not going to happen. You're not going to get something that is impossible, because now you're violating science certainty. But, a 20, 30% decrease, well, now that only happened once, 5 years ago. Well, you might get that because it'll happen, could happen again. That's within the realm of, stuff happens. So that's allowed. And you get a whole lot of people together, you're more likely to hit one of those high points rather than a 2 or 3%, change in it. Yeah, it is additive, but you can't just go on forever. Science certainty limits you to, there has to be some uncertainty into what you're doing. If you do something that leaves no wiggle room for the larger, for the other people in this reality who aren't ready for that yet to blow it off, you have to leave that. You have to leave that out.
This is a very rigid, real constraint on our human system.
Yeah.
But the learning opportunity can't be spoiled by violating significantly the uncertainty principle of stability.
Yeah, that is a restraint that we have to live with, and the reason we have to live with that restraint of science certainty is because otherwise our reality would kind of become discontinuous. There would be things changing and things jumping around, and it would no longer be this consistent learning lab for people to get their feedback and learn. There'd be all kinds of magic would be going on all the time. We'd live in a magical place, and that's not the best sort of learning lab. So that's kept to a point that it doesn't affect the quality of the learning lab to get the most people that are here raised up in their ability. Most people here couldn't deal well with living in a magic place. You can imagine what it would be like if everybody here could impose thoughts in your mind. If everybody here had the ability, well, even just to read your mind and know what you were thinking, it would be kind of chaotic. There'd be people fighting and struggling with each other and forcing, because they'd be using it for reasons of ego and for reasons, so we don't want that sort of a place. Actually, there are places on this planet that are like that, and they're mostly like on the coasts of Africa, where you have lots of people who all are aware, whole societies that are aware of the non-physical. They're aware of what you can do with it, and they're very awful places to live because people are constantly hurting other people. They are saying, give me money or I will make you ill. This sort of thing. You've got a lot of that going on in those places. It's a very rough environment to be in because the whole culture is aware of that, and people learn to do it, and it's a nasty place. We don't want we don't want that to spread too far. We'd like to keep most of the people here believing that it's all a bunch of nonsense and let them go on with their life and learning and so on, so that we don't get involved in that. Those who are ready, we want to understand. Those who are not ready, it's better that they don't know until they can understand. It's that sort of thing. You don't give You know, you don't give sharp objects to young children. It's better to just keep all those away from them. So it's that sort of thing. We had a question there.
There is one question that my children have asked ever since they were young, and I find it really hard to answer, but yet at the same time I really don't want to give them an answer, and that is whether there is a God. And I don't want to answer it because I'd like them to discover their own toe. But at the same time, they need something, they look to me as a mother with all the answers, and they need something to satisfy that question. Especially like my 9-year-old daughter right now. It seems really important to her, and I really don't know how to answer that.
Well, the best way to answer it is the same way you answer the 5-year-old's question is there a Santa Claus? Right? It's the same sort of thing. You don't want to squash, their feelings. You don't want to force them. You also don't want to lie to them. You're kind of stuck with, is there a Santa Claus, to your 3 or 4 or 5-year-old. It's the same issue. And the way that you approach that would be the same thing. You would say, well, it depends on what we mean by that word, God. God means a lot of different things to different people. And there's lots of beliefs about that and lots of dogma and ritual that people go through with related to that. And that's just their own beliefs. Someday you'll, grow up to be able to form your own beliefs about that subject, that sort of thing. So you don't want to say no, because then that confuses them. Well, all their friends, and other people and other people's parents, and they've got all that to deal with. So no is a little harsh for them at that age, I would agree. Yes, that's misleading, because what does that mean to them? What it means in their mind is probably wrong. What they would be thinking at 7 or 9 years old of, is there a God? They're thinking of the old man with the long white beard that's sitting on a cloud, playing with these pet people, right? And taking notes and checking it twice and that sort of thing. Well, to say yes to that is misleading. So what you need to do is find a middle way where you can say that there's lots of ways of thinking about that, and many of the ways that the concepts you have now, the little old man taking notes, they're wrong. It's not like that. But that's not to say that there isn't something larger or grander or better, or that our lives aren't more than just what we see here. And you'll be able to sort all that out as you get more experience. So something in that line would be the way to handle that, because it's just a flat yes or no is going to be misleading and difficult for them to deal with. In either case, they're not quite ready. They don't have the experience to process that. So keep it at a level that they can process, and you'll be fine. And usually children are happy to get something at a level that they can process. If you tell them something they can't process, it's like in one ear and out the other. It doesn't compute. So you have to be aware of where they are, and then just give them just a little bit more that challenges them a little, to say that, yeah, it's more than just this physical reality, but it's not necessarily like what you're hearing. You'll grow up and be able to figure that out for yourself. That kind of thing. That leaves the door open for them. Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to close the door. It's not that you need to indoctrinate them so they think of things the way you think of things. Yeah, that's an unnecessary trap that you're laying on them. Keep it open-minded. Yeah, another question. Dennis.
Rather than ask a question, I'd like to summarize 3 experiences or experiments and have you comment on them.
Okay.
That's okay. I put it under the kind of general subject matter of warping probability space. The first one I'd call creating a parking place. When I drive downtown in the middle of the day, there's like a 10-block area that's very congested. It's the middle of the day, everybody's at work, parking places are full, and what I wanted to do was go to an area and very quickly find a place. So I'd imagine a vacant one here or a vacant one there, and 7, 8 times out of 10, it would be there. Last time it happened, I was going down a dead-end street and there was no parking place, and I figured, well, this is, the 2 or 3, it doesn't happen. Turned around, somebody backed out right in front of me, and there was my parking place. The second one I would call penetrating the traffic stream. I used to ride my motorcycle to work a lot, and on this one route I had to stop and wait for all the incoming morning traffic to go by and have a break, and I could sit there for 5 minutes before there was an opening. So I decided that my arrival time there would coincide with the gap in traffic, and most of the time it happened. And I retired about 5 years ago, and I noticed when I was going by that same intersection on the main road, frequently the intersection would have been cleared for that entrance. Third one I would call repelling the deer. We've had a vacation place in West Virginia for 20 years. And driving back and forth, I mean, there's more deer than people, and I've hit probably half a dozen deer over the years, or had very close calls. So my thought was I'm probably wasting a lot of energy opening that traffic space for my motorcycle. I'm going to take that and transfer it to my deer repeller. So I created this tool in front of my car, which sort of, bow wave goes out in front, and it notifies all the deer that I'm coming and I really don't want to hit you. And, why don't you just wait a minute till I get by, sort of thing. And the frequency of sighting deer has gone down. No close calls. I haven't hit one in years.
All three of those things are really good examples, sort of like, old Betsy, the car that gets you there even when, everybody wonders how it actually did. The mechanic tells you that this car isn't going to make it for another week, and you go for another month because you can't afford the bill or something like that. Yeah, they all fit into that area where there is uncertainty. Wherever there is uncertainty in the outcome, you can manipulate the probabilities for that outcome. And there's a lot of people, I bet, who make traffic spaces. That's something that's normal. And I know that everybody that lives in New York who has to merge on the Long Island Expressway knows how to make holes for their car, because if you don't, there are no holes. You'll sit there on the ramp, until rush hour's over if you don't, and everybody knows that. They just fall right down in there and move over, and a hole opens up and they fit right into it. That's just the way it is. And people who live in those environments get used to that. It's just a fact of life. They don't even think about it anymore. They just know that somehow a hole will be there. And most of the time there is, not necessarily all the time, but like you say, it works most of the time. But that's where you have uncertainty. There's uncertainty in the parking. Parking comes and goes all the time. There's always people that have to leave. Unfortunately, there's a lot fewer of those than the people who leave their cars there interstate, so they don't happen constantly. But if you put energy into it, one will happen just when you need it. When, all those things that you say are good. And that's where we get to modify the future probabilities with our intent. And because those probabilities are uncertain within a margin, we can do that. Because it's only a 2 sigma case that you don't see any deer, and it's only maybe a 3 sigma case that you can't find a parking place, or that you would find a parking place. So all those things are not miracles. We can't do any miracles that at least everybody else around us sees as a miracle. That's prohibited. But we can certainly work in the margins of uncertainty, and we should take advantage of that. That's our right as consciousness. Those kinds of things you can alter. And the fact that you're doing it for your convenience, that's not a problem. It's good practice for you. Now if you're doing it for somebody else's inconvenience, that's a problem. But sure, good things to do, good examples of how conscious intent modifies the probable future. Those little probabilities of a parking place being someplace start to change because you're thinking about it. The more focused your intent is, the more effective you are. If your intent, again, is jumping all around, your mind's here, your mind's there. Oh, I'd like a parking space, but gee, I wonder what I'm going to do when I get there. And, I wonder if the shop is going to have this. And if your mind's flying around, it's not going to do much good. Again, you have to learn to focus and hold that intent clear and steady, and put a lot of energy in it. And when you do, it works. But it's statistical. It doesn't necessarily work 100% of the time, but a lot of the time. Okay, more questions. Anybody who hasn't asked a question want to ask a question? Yes?
This is perhaps a common question again, but in your opinion, when does a consciousness take over a mere physical entity?
Okay, consciousness takes over not exactly at conception, but when there is enough brain material developed for the consciousness to inhabit a physical structure. The consciousness basically inhabits a physical structure that it can, that physical structure can express it, okay? You have to have that. Like we talk about conscious computers. When a computer is able to become conscious, that's going to be a computer that is able to change itself, right? In a way, write its own programs, right? It needs to be a computer that is self-modifying. And it has to have enough ability, enough memory, enough self-modification, a purpose. It has to, all those things that consciousness does. And if such a thing exists, it will develop consciousness. It's not really that a consciousness needs to be placed in it. You don't build a conscious computer. You build a computer that is capable of containing and expressing consciousness, and consciousness happens. It's that sort of thing. So we don't build a conscious computer. We don't program consciousness. We just make the physical way that consciousness can manifest, and then it happens. It's the same with an embryo. When there's enough physical there that consciousness can express itself within it, which usually would mean brain tissue and so on, then consciousness will inhabit that entity. And that's not the case when it's 1 cell, 2 cells, 3 cells. But that's long before it's born. You can interact with the consciousness of a baby that's still unborn by just thinking about it. You can communicate with them like you can any other consciousness. You can talk to them. You know, they hear music, they hear arguments, they get, you know, if you're upset, you know, they get those biochemicals that define upset to them. All of that, you know, it's not like they're just tucked away and don't have any interaction, you know, until they're born. No, they have a lot of interaction. You know, you should interact with your unborn child. You should talk to it. My daughter is named Liana because that's what she asked me to name her, okay, before she was born. So you should do those. And you asked me a question that I never answered.
Right, it was about it.
There was the second one. How did you know intent was the prime mover? Yeah, and I'm sorry, but it just occurred to me that you asked me. I just kind of slipped back in time there. I said, yeah, I slipped out on that one. Intent, I understood that intent was the prime mover as I did experiments to try to isolate what made a difference. You know, what was it? And you just do a whole lot of experiments of what works, doesn't work. So it was more of a trial and error at first until eventually I just isolated intent as the active ingredient. It was just trial and error experimentation. Most every conclusion I've come to has been a result of experimental effort. Trying this, trying that, see what works, what doesn't, try to figure out why. Under what conditions does this work? Under what condition doesn't? And you just keep working it down until you get to a point where it's got to be this. You know, that's the only thing that's consistent. It's the only logical, consistent point. So experimentation, trial and error, that's the way to do it. All right, now everybody ask a question that wants to. Are we going back for those who, you know, for second and thirds and fourths? All right, raise your hand if you want to ask a question. All right, so you were the quickest.
With respect to love, are there different, I know that's like the lowest entropy sort of state. Are there different types of love? Do you love your partner in a different way? You love your kids in a different way?
We break love. You can, you know, a loving intent can be expressed in many ways. Let's put it that way. Yes. You know, you love your parents, you love your kids, you love your spouse. You know, you love your lover, you love your dog, you know, you have all sorts of things. You love sunshine in the spring, you know, all sorts of things. And there's lots of ways to express love. And when humankind has maybe 4 or 5 of those that are real common ways to express love, they give them names, right? And you get the Greek names, the agape, and you know all that. So that's just because those are common expressions of love, but those are just expressions. So love is a kind of a singular thing. It's a low entropy consciousness, and it's not like, oh well, this is the low entropy conscious love, and this is the the blue and green striped love, and it's different. Love is love. It's all one thing, but there's lots of different expressions and ways you can do that. There's love maybe if you're just sitting and watching a little old lady hobble across the street, and you just may feel something about her. Your heart just may kind of connect with her. There's this little old person that's getting around the best they can, and you just may have this feeling that goes out for that person. You may not know them or never see them again, but that's love. But what kind of love is that? Well, it may not have a name, because that's maybe not so common that the Greeks decided to name it. So there's just categories that we've named, but those are not separate things. But we can say, why is this category different than the other? So we tend to make them separate. They're all just different expressions. So love is love, and it's low entropy. And when you are the very lowest entropy being, then it's not that you act loving, which you do, it's that you are love. You're an expression of love. Your thoughts, your actions, your motivations, your intents just express love. And that's really the goal that we're working to. That's the most optimal state for consciousness to be in. Okay, others? Yep.
Is there a way, or have you ever tried to measure intent, or try to understand more in detail the relationship between intent and the amount of influence you can have on a certain result?
Yeah, I have noticed that intent, I kind of measure intent by the effect I can have on the result. That's kind of the measurement that I make. Intent has to do with something that's deeper than wishing. It's basically the fundamental motivation at the being level is where your intent comes from. It's not an intellectual thing. Of course, we voiced it intellectually. I intend that, this person have an energy body, and here's his, black spots and white spots and so on. So our intent is the way that we move, that's the word we use for consciousness interacting with consciousness. It's all consciousness. So the intent is kind of our focus. But now we can be strongly focused or lightly focused. We can be focused some of the time and focused, all the time. And that's the difference in intent. So when we intend things and have a major effect, that's when we're able to have our mind so clear that that intent stays strong and on all the time. Most of us, our minds jump around. And we learn that when we first start to meditate. The very first time you sit down and meditate, and they say, just clear your mind of thoughts. And that works for about a millisecond, right? And then there's a thought. And then you get rid of that, and another millisecond, there's another thought. And we realize how full of junk our minds are all the time. These thoughts are just always coming in. So then we say, this is impossible. I can't clear my mind of thoughts. I can't stop it from thinking. It's thinking all the time. Now it's thinking about not thinking, And now I'm obsessed with clearing my mind of thoughts, and that's a thought. And it's like, how do you get rid of this? That's where the mantra comes in. So now you just start saying this sound, because that just takes up space. It's like filling your mind full of cotton, It's just a nonsense thing that fills your mind up with mantra, so you're not thinking because you're filling your mind up with mantra. That's thinking, but it's kind of a simple, monosyllable kind of thinking that's non-operative. And that's why eventually you learn to let the mantra go, because you can go beyond even thinking the mantra. You can let that go too. So our minds tend to they have intents, but the intent's here and there and everywhere else and flying around. That intent is more effective when it's steady and clear and pure. And that's usually when you get to that point consciousness. Okay, now there isn't anything else. It's quiet. No thoughts, no sensory perception, just existence at a point. When you reach that point and can hold it for a long time, now the intent that you focus is clear and steady, and that's when you become very, very effective. So that's I get to that understanding just by what state am I in when I'm effective, you know. So that's the experiments that lead me to that understanding. I'm not effective when I'm scattered. I'm not effective when I just wish to be effective. I have to be able to get in that state where my mind has no other focus but the one that I'm focused on. And then that's the intent. But we are just consciousness, so we can interact and move consciousness. Yeah, Dennis?
To continue that point, have you noticed the difference between an intent that's neutral, sort of sterile, or an intent that's associated with very strong emotional, personal contact?
Yes, and there is a difference between those, and it depends on how each of those gets, you know, where each of those comes from. Emotions can be a great focuser. You know, if there's something that is, you know, the emotion does not have to be high entropy. Emotion can be a good focuser, but emotion can be high entropy, particularly if that emotion has something to do with fear. It's generally very high entropy. But emotion can focus. And if you have a sterile intent, one that's just, you know, somebody asked you to go heal somebody you never heard of, right? So you don't really have a dog in that fight. You're not, you know, it's just you're helping out somebody. Okay, well, you go and you see that it's not a problem, and okay, you're not going to be interfering, and I see you go and you heal them. Well, you can still be very effective in that might be what you're thinking of as a more sterile intent. You can still be very effective in that if you can really focus on it. Most of us, when we try to work on something like that, well, if we're not really personally involved, then we don't really care so much, then our mind isn't really focused that tightly, and we do kind of drift around. So sometimes that's harder. On the other hand, sometimes emotion's harder, because if the emotion's something that you get your ego attached to, then that can get in the way too. That's why doctors don't operate on their children, you know, on their wives, because they lose their objectivity and they can't function very well. And emotion can do that to you too. So there is a difference though, but you ought to be able to focus that intent in a sterile environment and be very strong with it, and actually be as strong with it as it is in an emotional environment. It just takes more practice. And the emotional environment, you ought to be able to be strong with that as long as you don't have your ego attached to it. Once your ego attached to it and you do care about the outcome, then your objectivity's gone, and you're now wishing. You're not really focusing intent. Okay. Yeah, we've overlooked you for a while. You, Chris. Yeah.
Tom, if a person in our PMR greatly reduced their entropy to the point where they became more loving and very efficient, and it wouldn't be profitable for them to come back here anymore, is that possible for somebody to graduate from our system? And if it is, what would happen to that person?
Yes, it is possible for people to graduate, and they don't have to become perfect to do it. All they have to do is become in a situation where they can learn in some other system better. Okay, if you get to a point where some other system suits you better than this one, then that's the one for you. You tend to migrate to that. That being said, not coming back here doesn't necessarily mean that you've perfected again. It just means that you found another thing that's better for you. On the other side of that, coming back here doesn't mean that you're still flawed and you have a lot more to learn, although there's always something to learn here. But there are those entities that come here primarily just to help out and teach. And those are usually the ones that, we, like, again, we keep talking about the Dalai Lama just because he's somebody everybody knows who's very spiritual. So, he came here with a purpose. He didn't just come here, because he happened to be born and magic happened and he turned into the Dalai Lama. It was a very purposeful incarnation to take such a role. So it wasn't necessarily that he had so much to learn either, as it is he had so much to give. So it works both ways. First you learn, and the more you learn, the more your task also comes to be to give. So in the beginning, it's information you take in and you're growing, and it's like that. You get to a point where now it's information you take in and you're giving back. And that's just part of the process here. And that'll be part of the process in this lifetime as well as in other lifetimes. As you get to the point where you can give back, you do that. But you're not necessarily, everybody's at that point. A lot of people are just at the point where they're just still growing themselves. They're not to the point yet where they're teaching. So that's just a different aspect. So in a way, you don't really outgrow it. There's always more to do here. There's always something you can do here. But yes, this reality is not the only and not the best for everyone. And once you get to a point where this is kind of a hard scrabble, rough and tumble place compared to some realities, and you can get to a point where there's other things that are more meaningful in your evolution. So you can outgrow this elementary school and graduate, so to speak.
I have a question about like husbands and wives, those that are very, very close. Do they ever meet again?
They can. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. If they wish to be involved in each other's growth, say in another in another lifetime, they can be that. Sometimes people have incarnations in groups that are going to interact with each other. Sometimes they have plans that connect with each other. Often when you meet people like that, the recognition is almost immediate. You run into somebody and you've planned this connection. And whether that's a connection to irritate you so that you can outgrow it, or whether that's a connection to, that's warm and fuzzy and nice, it doesn't matter, it just clicks. And you get that connection and you know it, and there's no real good reason that it should be there, but you just feel it and know it. Those kinds of things are often planned. Not always. There's a large random component in the things we do. We get faced with stuff and we have to deal with it. That's part of it. And the randomness helps keep it rich and varied. It gives us more opportunity. But there are plans too. And you and others, significant others, may often have incarnated together or as a team or working with each other. It doesn't necessarily mean that it'll always be husband and wife. It could be in something else. It could be mother and daughter. It could be, the roles can change. But it's the loving relationship that may continue just because you're good for each other as far as egging each other on to grow up, And if you have that, then yes, it works good together. So it doesn't always necessarily repeat itself, but there are some people that you work well with, and those you may incarnate with, more than once. It's not always just a random draw. Other questions? Yes, Stan.
If I may, I'd like to amplify on Dennis's question.
Okay.
If you go to the dictionary and look up the word intent, you'll discover several other words that fall either side of it, contain a larger or a smaller meaning of what we would take intent to mean here. And you can explore with those other words, substituting or holding them for the meaning of intent. And you will find that you will get different degrees or points of access. This was we're talking about here. Take an example, you do an experiment that would see intent finely sliced in time and feed that into the RV experience. And what you get out of that is a video frame rate of different degrees of visual access to the target at such point. So in and around that, there is some interesting experimentation that go on.
Yes, and everyone should experiment in their own way, and it's individual. It's the intent isn't your intellectual thought about the intent so much as what you mean at a being level. The intent comes out of a deeper level than just your intellect. And the words you use to express that meaning are not as important as the meaning that you're trying to express. Yeah. Okay, other questions? We still have some more time, yeah.
At any point when you were working with Robert Monroe and everyone else, or just by yourself, did you ever attempt to put numbers to your big toe or to what you were doing? Did you ever try to use math or, I guess, physics, as in PMR physics and PMR science?
Only in so much as you keep track of some statistics when you're trying to define what effects you're having. And you have to use statistics for that. And you can do that actually with the numbers, or you can just kind of keep track in your head. But yes, that's kind of a mathematical approach. And the reason you need statistics is because this is a subjective thing that we're talking about. So if you heal somebody and they get better, well, maybe they just got better anyway. You know, you don't know that you healed them. They were sick, you send them healing energy, they get better, but to come to the conclusion that you just healed them is not necessarily a good conclusion. You can only come to that conclusion with statistics. You need to heal, 100 people. And if 50 of them get better, well, you're not doing much, right? That's 50-50. You'd expect maybe half of them to get better. If you just kind of randomly do that, it doesn't mean you're doing anything. But if 98% of them get better, well, now you've got some statistics showing you that you're being effective. So yes, statistics are very important, otherwise you never know. You can't do one thing and come to a conclusion about it. That may be an error. You have to do a lot of things. And that's true of a lot of our science. It's not just this science, but there's other science. All the pharmacology is in the same problem. You give somebody a pill, and whether that pill's effective or not, well, just because it makes them well doesn't mean that pill's effective. They may have gotten well anyway. So all the pharmacology we do that makes medicines be determined by the establishment to be effective are all statistical studies. There's no other way to find out. You just have to do it a whole lot and see how it works. And things that you get to a point where you've healed thousands of people. You've attempted to heal thousands of people. You can get some pretty good statistics. If you've only done it 3 times, you really don't know what you're doing yet. That's why I say practice, experiment, do it yourself. You have to do that. And you have to do it over and over again. Otherwise, you will never know what you're doing. So that's the mathy part. Other than that, math is the logic of quantity. Okay, that's what mathematics basically is. It's the logic of quantity, how quantities relate to each other. And there is a logic in that, and you have certain rules. There's not a lot of rules in math. You probably get a half a dozen rules, or all the rules there are. It's just very fundamental rules, and the rest of it is logic. Well, the logic of quantity doesn't apply real well to consciousness, other than in things like how many people did you heal and how many of them actually got better. Then it does. The logic of quantity is a natural fit to the physical reality, because all of our rule sets, our physical stuff is quantity, right? It's all quantity. How much of this, how much of that, can you change this to that? And it's all about quantity. So math is a natural modeler for physical reality. It's not a natural modeler for the non-physical reality. It doesn't work real well there. So math tends to do little picture logic, and it's not real applicable to big picture logic, because big picture logic is subjective and it doesn't have much to do with quantity. It has to do more with quality, and math doesn't do much with quality. It only does with quantity. So they're just different realms. Okay, Andrea?
You had an acronym, GIGO.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Garbage in, garbage out.
Okay, I knew it was going to be something.
Yeah, and what that was referring to was that if you, if you don't, if you're not focused with your intent, if you have a lot of noise in the circuit, nothing comes out very well. So that's the thing. So if you're not really focused and you don't really know what you're doing and your mind is skipping around, don't expect results. That's a garbage in, garbage out, you know. You may get results, you know, you may see little green men, you know, with pointy ears, but that doesn't mean that it means anything because you're not really stable in your focus. So, yeah, that was tricky. Yes.
I was wondering how much relevance remains of Einstein's relativity in lieu of your big toe.
Well, the relevance is that it describes physical reality very well as far as the you know, length contraction, time dilation, all those things, you know. And then general relativity just takes that and adds acceleration rather than just constant velocity, so it adds gravitation. But it's all based on that constant, you know, value for the speed of light. So in as much as that constant value for the speed of light represents physical reality, then Einstein's relativity is a wonderful tool for physical matter reality, you know, prediction of what's going to happen, because it's part of the rule, you know, that's part of the rule set. So it's very valuable when they spin particles around in a cyclotron to get them up to higher energies, you know, to crash things. They have to worry about relativistic effects. If they didn't, they'd never be able to do it. So it allows them to build tools that use those effects. There's lots of places where those effects are important. So it's good. But now as far as the big picture goes, yeah, once you get to the bigger picture where you want to do more than just compute what's going on in physical matter reality, then, you know, relativity means nothing. The next step up in relativity is that there is no fundamental reality frame. That's the next step up. That's the next level of relativity. It's not that there is no inertial frame. That's basically, it doesn't matter about speed of light. It's always the same. There is no fundamental inertial frame. Okay, the next step is there is no fundamental reality frame. All reality frames are basically the same. It's just up to the observer. The observer defines what happens in that reality frame. Which reality frame is physical is the one the observer's in. The ones that are non-physical is the reality frames the observer is not in. And that's for all the observers in all the different reality frames, you see. So that's the next level, that's the next step up. So relativity in the big picture is there is no fundamental reality frame. It's all relative to the observer. And that's a major concept, you know, that's a step up in relativity.
So you have, if Einstein had his equation of equals mc squared, do you have an equation?
You sound like a guy that asked me that question on a radio program. He said, he says, Einstein said E equals mc squared. Can you summarize your theory up that concretely? And I thought, nah, you know, that's a tough question. So I thought about it for a minute. I said, I have to come up with something. What can I come up with? So I said, yes, I can actually do Einstein better. I can only use 2 elements, not 5. I said, R equals I, reality equals information. And that then started to pop up on slides. It started to show up in advertisement because Donna Aveni Warner thought that was so cute that she started sticking it on everything. So now R equals I has, you know, that's what that little, you know, that little angel there in that one picture had an R equals I on it. But that's Donna is spreading that particular word because in my sense, 2 things equal to each other is not really an equation, it's an identity. You know, it just says reality equals information. So that's what you were getting at?
I reckon.
Keith? Yes, Carl?
Can you talk a little bit about the male-female selection process? And is that something that you always choose when you come here? And if so, what happens if you don't get what you choose? Well, how does that affect your experience here?
Well, you can select a lot of things when you come here, and you can allow some things just to be random. It depends on the level of control you want over your experience. If you have very specific things you want to learn, okay, you're a fairly evolved being and you have very certain things that you want to learn, and you kind of talk with the guides, you know, you're interacting with the system, and here's a good situation for you. Well, if that situation is better for your learning, if you're female, then you'll incarnate as a female, and you get to choose that. If it's something that you could learn better as a male, then you'll incarnate as a male. If it's something that really doesn't make any difference, whether it's male or female, then you may not choose at all. You may just say, whatever, and you let chance supply that information rather than manipulating chance to supply the information that you want. Again, that's manipulating the probable reality with intent. That can be done, real well. So it might be chance, it might be chosen, and if it's chosen, it probably doesn't end up wrong. It probably, the choice is probably pretty good, but again, in the margin, anything can happen. Any strange thing can happen. So you tend to pick the male or female role based on a couple of things. What I said first is that what you need to grow. But sometimes when you've been in all those roles many times, so you've been male a lot of times, you've been female a lot of times, you've learned those kind of lessons that you learn from both perspectives, and now you're going back again. You may, instead of letting it be random, you may decide, well, I kind of identify with being female, or identify with being male. That just feels more natural to me. It's kind of my choice. Well, then you can make that choice just for that reason. But you do have to be some of each. You can't just always be male or just always be female, because otherwise your perspective gets lopsided. Males and females have different realities. They see things differently. They interpret things differently. Their brains are different. They're fundamentally different perspectives on reality. And you have to have all of those perspectives. So you will sample both sexes enough that you learn from both perspectives. But you can just choose one because you like that better. You just kind of settle in that's more your style, so to speak. And then you can just kind of persist in that for a while. But you can't do that early on. You only can do that after you've been around a bit. So there are entities that you would call male or female, non-physical entities. Of course, there's no bodies, but you designate them as male or female just because of the way you interpret them and their data, their energy. Again, energy is a metaphor. So you interact with this being, and they just kind of interact with you, and it feels male because that's the way the interaction is. So you call them male. You say, oh yeah, there was, I interacted with this being, and he's a male, da, 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 da. It doesn't really mean that he has sex organs. This is non-physical. There is no body. It just means that they interact in a manner that reminds you of male, so you interpret that as male. That's the way that works out. When we give non-physical beings sexual identities, that's why. It's because they tend to act in that role that we associate with male or female.
Did you say it? I think you said at some point that the big dude or the big cheese was male.
Yeah, that's just my impression. That's my impression of the interaction. Yes. So when I interact with him, he interacts with me in that way. He has no sexuality. In the non-physical, there's no body. Sexuality here is a PMR thing. It's a physical thing. But we take the traits with us sometimes, and we interact with those traits. And that's what makes us appear male or female from the non-physical.
How have you tested out that the big cheese is the last in the hierarchy of bigger, bigger, bigger?
Well, I don't test that out. It's just the big cheese is the let's say it's the highest official that I've come in contact with. Now, what else is beyond that? I've got a vague notion that the big cheese does interact with other beings. I mean, the big cheese actually changed jobs some years ago. We've got a new big cheese, and that big cheese.
Not cheeses of Nazareth.
No, cheese, as in cheese sandwich.
That's a joke.
Yeah, cheese as in cheese sandwich, and I use terms like big cheese and the dude from beyond and other things, just because I want to keep that concept light. I don't want people to suddenly deify things and make it a god and another religion. We don't want the religion of the big toe. That's not the point. So I try to keep that stuff as light and as possible, so it doesn't encourage people to fall into old patterns. So that's why it's the big cheese and the big dude and that kind of stuff. It's just to keep people from taking it too seriously. If I acted very reverent in my book, then people would take a different focus on it entirely. So I'm trying to be irreverent just to keep that from happening. But yes, there was a change in the being that does that. And my sense was that there was others that made that selection. It wasn't a random choice. It wasn't, the last person standing got the job or anything like that. There was a selection process and an appointment made. So no, the big cheese isn't the biggest cheese. He's just the kind of the administrator of N division. Yeah. And why do you need administrators? Because like any big complex system, there's housekeeping that has to be done, rules and data and things that have to be stored, some decisions have to be made. Any complex system can't be random. It has to have some control, some pattern, and it can't be set up to where everything is entirely automatic. It doesn't work like that. This is a system that runs on free choice. You can't set it up as an automatic system.
It's got a heart.
Yeah.
It's got a heart.
It's got a heart, right. So there has to be different levels of beings or stations, if you will, where the system has an administrative function. And that happens in your computer too. Every once in a while you'll get this little sign that says, do you want to archive your data yet? And you usually say, no, leave me alone. But sometimes you say yes, and it goes off and it does stuff. Well, these are administrative functions that need to be done every once in a while. Otherwise, your data files get too big and the programs don't work well. So they're set into the software. Any complex system needs some administrative functions to keep working. And the consciousness system isn't any different. So you do have these levels of administration, if you will, that kind of keep things running. But no, it's not God playing with these pet people. It doesn't work that way. Now, some people, say, well, the consciousness system, that's God, is the conscious. Well, what's God? What do you mean by that word? And, is it the big cheese? Is it, and I try to make a little fun of it in my book, where I talk about all the various hats that, the big cheese wears or that wears. And there's no point in going there. That's our tendency, that's our ego tendency to break things into pigeonholes, make things separate, give them each functions, and make a nice little hierarchy so we know who to salute, and who we don't have to salute. And that's of no value. The system works. And the system works however it works. And the good news is that the system's trying to help you succeed. Other than that, we make most of the rest of it up. We make guides into people and with boring jobs. We invent lots of metaphors to describe things. We put robes on all the people that we see that we don't know, and we dress the rest in the period costume. We do a lot of this ourselves. But you just have to read between those lines. Don't take any of that real literally. And consciousness is that bigger system. If you need some bigger system that you are a part of, as opposed to just being physical, then if you want to call that God, you can. But generally, because that word means something to most people that's very dogmatic and narrow, I tend to avoid the word. So you hardly find that word in my books, because when you say that, the large majority of people get a very narrow focus. And I don't want that narrow focus. I want the big focus. That's why Bob wouldn't use the word astral projection, because at the time, if you said that, put you in a box. You got a real narrow focus. He wanted to be taken more seriously than that narrow focus, so he just changed the word. Don't use a word that has a narrow focus, Call it OOBE, and now it's something new. You don't put it in that old box with a narrow focus. So I kind of avoid the God word, because I don't want it to be a narrow focus. But hey, individuals, do what you want with it. Whatever makes you feel comfortable.
When you were thinking of the phrase computers going conscious, were you thinking basically only of software evolution driving up the organization, down the entropy, or were you admitting the possibility of hardware evolution of the computer along with software and robotic, et cetera, et cetera?
A conscious entity is going to have some hardware and software. It has to be combination. Hardware by itself doesn't do much. It's just potential. The software by itself doesn't do much. It's just potential. It's not until you put the two together. And we are also hardware and software. You know, this is the hardware, right? And the software is basically here and in consciousness. You know, that's where the software is. Well, a computer will become conscious, but not conscious like a human. You know, we think of, well, there's conscious like humans and then everything else doesn't matter. A computer isn't going to be just another human. The first conscious computers are going to be more like bumblebees. You know, they're going to be very dim consciousness with very small decision space. But it's still going to be conscious because they're going to be making choices. And they will have the ability to make their own choices. Nobody's going to tell them, you must do this, you must do that. They must have enough fuzzy logic, not just algorithms that depend on making this choice, if that. You know, it's not just if-thens. That's deterministic. There has to be enough actual fuzzy choice in there. Do they make a determination that this is your face? You know, like one of those security cameras that looks at your face, recognizes the face, and if it does, it opens the door for you to go in. Well, it has to make a choice whether or not it sees a face that is enough like yours in the data bank to open the door. Well, that's almost getting to the point where it's making choices, because it does that with neural nets and things that aren't discrete. They're not deterministic. It actually is making choices. And you say it has free will. Well, how else is it making choices? You know, it's making choices, and you can give it the same data and it will make different choices. You know, even if you walk up to it twice, one time it might open the door, the next time it might not, because it doesn't repeat itself. When you get a machine that can have a larger decision space, that we can actually recognize that it has consciousness, then you will get something that you can interact with, and it will interact with you in a way that's a little unpredictable. You know, we're all a little unpredictable. We're mostly predictable, but we have free will, and so will that consciousness. You can't get consciousness without free will. Free will and consciousness are like opposite sides of the same coin. You can't get one without the other. There is no consciousness without free will. There is no free will without consciousness. Those two they're part of the same thing.
They're an entangled pair.
They're an entangled pair, exactly. So we will one day get conscious computers, because we will one day have computers that have enough decision space that they will show that they're making decisions. And that will no doubt happen. Right now we have very rudimentary things. We have little computer things that go around like bugs. We kind of have bug consciousness now, where they put separate little motors on all the joints and so on, and they give it a neural network or some very vague decision points, and they find out that these things act like insects. They come to stairs or barriers, they make decisions to go over them or around them or what they do. And when you look at their behavior, they behave very much like insects. You know, you watch them, and they take movies of them, and you watch insects, and you see the same kind of behavior. Well, that is consciousness. It's just at a very dim level with a very small decision space. So we already have conscious computers. They're just not at a level that we say they're conscious. You know, we don't admit that yet. But eventually they will be. And when they are, you know, we will interact with them. We will give them purpose. You know, purpose is one of the things that a consciousness needs to be a consciousness. Our purpose is to reduce entropy. This conscious computer will probably have a purpose that we give it besides. You know, like in this reality frame, the purpose is survival and procreation. That's what evolved. That's what we evolve by. That's the criteria. We will give that computer some criteria by which it evolves, something that it's supposed to do, and it will judge its behavior based on how well it meets the criteria, and it will modify its behavior to meet the criteria, and that will evolve it. Okay, so in a way we can limit or control that, just like we're limited or controlled within this physical reality, how we evolve. We can loosen that up. We may even get to the point where we unleash it altogether. Then it can go wherever it can go, but it's still dependent on the software and the hardware, just like we are. We can't do more than what our brain can support. We have a brain injury and half the brain's gone. We can't do as much as we used to do, because now the hardware isn't able to support any more function than that. You know, it's that sort of thing. And it'll basically work the same way. So there's going to be a lot of interesting things going to happen in the future with technology. But right now the scientists have it wrong as far as they're trying to create consciousness through programming. You can't do that. You have to create the structure that can support it, and it happens. Consciousness just happens. That's how we got it in the first place. We had this potential that could support a 1 or a 0, 2 states, and it just happens. You see, it's the same thing. It doesn't take someone to construct it. It just takes a potential that can, that can support it, and you get it. Well, a structure that can just support a 1 or a 0, that's a pretty dim consciousness. That's not even up to an insect yet, but that's all it takes. Because if it can change to 2 states, then why can't it change to 3, and then to 10, and then to 1,000,000? You know, if it has this capacity to make differentiations, eventually it can learn to make more differentiations, and then pretty soon you end up with consciousness, and here we are. You know, so it's just a natural system that has evolved. So I'm not, I'm actually turning consciousness into science, you see. I'm turning metaphysics into science. It's just an evolved, natural system of which we are a logical result. That's basically the bottom line. So there goes the mysticism, right? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I do appreciate it.